Before we start, I'd just like to say a quick thank you to our podcast sponsor, PensionBee, who are one of the UK's leading online pension providers. Now, PensionBee can help you transfer most of your old pensions together into one simple and low-cost plan, all through their app and online platform. Now, if you're looking for a low-cost, hassle-free way to consolidate your pension pots, except final salary pensions, that is, then PensionBee is worth considering, especially as it does not lock you in with exit penalties, which I really like. That's because it leaves you free to move your money at a future date if you so wish. I think it's a combination of investment fund performance, low costs, and its slick app interface, which has been integral in PensionBee gaining over 250,000 customers and receiving an excellent rating on Trustpilot from over 1,800 reviews. Now, you can sign up with the names of your old employers in 5 minutes. PensionBee's plans are managed by the likes of BlackRock, State Street Global Advisors, Legal & General or HSBC, and as always with investments, your capital is at risk. For more information, go to pensionbee.com.
Hello and welcome to episode 262 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert Damien Fay and me, Andy Leeks. Well, strictly that's not quite true because unfortunately we haven't got your resident expert this week, Damien Fay, because he's a little under the weather, and so Damien's going to be having a week off this week's pod, so we thought it might be a great opportunity to dig into the archives and pick out a couple of pieces that are evergreen. We try and make stuff evergreen, as you know, on this podcast, so we've had a good deep dig around into the archives and we picked out 2 pieces which we think would be great for this week's pod. Now, you may have already heard them, but obviously new listeners have probably missed out on these ones, so we've picked out 2 pieces. The first one is going to be about financial well-being and the other piece is going to be about the 50-30-20 rule. So we hope you enjoy this week's podcast. It's a bit of a revisit, but we'll be back to normal next week. Enjoy this week's pod and I'll see you briefly on the other side before we'll see you again back next week.
I've been asked the question about the most important thing people should do to improve their financial well-being. And so this is the gem, one of the crown jewels, as it were, that somebody's asked me, and I'll explain why in a second. And I'm going to cover that, and so it's one that's worth listening to. I'm like you, I like to read around the kind of well-being stuff, and there's some fantastic books. If anybody wants to know, tweet me and I'll share some of the ones I've read that are around that, but not money related, that relate to just, like you say, happiness and well-being. And there is an overlap, if you look, or maybe the word's an application of some of that stuff to money, if you think and try hard enough. Now, I was asked as part of what is now going to be called International Podcast Day, which is, I think, in the next week or so. And another podcast, one that I've been interviewed on before, got in touch and asked me what is the most important thing people should do to improve their financial well-being. And they wanted me to do a bit of a snippet. And it got me thinking about what is the thing. So it's like a blank, almost like a blank canvas on which to throw that at. And that's quite a it might seem a tricky or big question on the face of it. Now, I could sit there and come up with, like a lot of people probably might do who deal with money, something about debts or some clever financial trick they should be doing, or do you know what I mean, or investing. Yeah. And I got philosophical, as you said, Andy. And part of that came about, the spark came from earlier on today, in fact. My daughter came up, as she does in the mornings at a ridiculous time, and woke us up and ready for the day. And we were chatting about, I don't know how we got onto it, we started talking about age. And she asked, why do old people get wrinkly? So when you're old, why do you get wrinkly? And of course, it's a very difficult thing really to try and explain to a 6-year-old, but it pretty much came down to like the passage of time. And that idea this stuck with me for the rest of the day when I started pondering this stuff. And my tip to improve their financial well-being, or anybody's, is to build a default plan. Now hang on to that time thing I just mentioned, because I'm going to come on to it. My tip is to build a default plan, okay? By that I mean that if all else fails, the default will kick in, and by pure default, you're going to end up at a certain destination. Does that make sense? Okay, yeah. So, I mean, it's a bit like if you went on a bus, if you fall asleep, you're going to get to your eventual destination, or you get a taxi. Do you know what I mean? You're not having to do anything. You're in transition, and that's kind of you're going there, the default, if that makes sense. So I'm always a big fan of building defaults in life, whether it's a career plan or anything to do with money or my own life or whatever. So that it's like a fallback. So the idea behind it, when I sort of sat down and thought about it, I was trying to explain this, is actually the crux of all this financial well-being is to try and turn any solution to a problem you've got that's related to money. Normally that solution relates to pounds and pence, doesn't it? It means money. So if you've got debts, it means you need more money. Or if you want to invest or retire, it means something to do with money.
Yeah.
It's actually to try and change it into a function of time rather than money. So now you get where I was going with that story of my 6-year-old coming in and we were chatting about age and stuff like that. Because the most powerful, not to get all Brian Cox about it, but I remember watching one of his programs, the one force in the universe which we can't control that will happen no matter what is time, okay? So we are going to go travel forward in time no matter what happens. Other things like direction, all these things we can stop. But time, we can't. So the idea behind my philosophical answer to that question, which will probably surprise them because I'm not going to give something that's very practical, well, it is in a way practical, but not the way they envisage, is to turn any problem and financial issue you've got, the solution, turn it into a function of time. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. A good one is debt, okay? So let's say you've got a load of debt. Now, the issue you've got is you need to pay off that debt and you need money to do it. And it seems like a mountain, an Everest that you've got to climb. And you don't know how to do it, how you're going to acquire it or something like that. So a good example, which I've touched upon, I think I may have touched upon it in a podcast previously about debt, but it's worth pulling out and talking about it a bit more today, is that the average person in the UK has a debt of £2,346. Apparently, that is the average debt. And the typical APR on a credit card debt of that size is 18% a year. That's a lot. And then the minimum payment you have to pay. You know, when you get a credit card, you pay the minimum each month.
Yeah.
And you shouldn't do that, because if you pay the minimum, it would actually take you over 25 years to clear that debt, only paying off the minimum. Because you pay the minimum and then they add interest again. And you're just chipping away ever so slightly, aren't you? Because if you think of 1%, let's say that's 60 quid. 60 quid doesn't come off your bill, because that actually a large chunk of that £60 is new interest. So you're only probably chipping away £10, £20 or something like that. That makes sense?
Yeah.
Now, obviously you've got to pay more than the minimum, because then that actually means that you're chipping away more. One of the tricks is actually to, rather than pay more, if given that size debt, that minimum probably is around about £60 a month. As your debt, what would normally happen, as you start chipping away at that debt, paying that minimum, then the debt gets smaller and then your payment starts to reduce. So it's kind of one of those things you never get to the finish line. If instead you took the £60 you're paying this month and wrote to your credit card company, so I'm going to pay a fixed amount of £60 a month, don't rack up any more debt. As your debt starts to reduce, your monthly payment is fixed, okay? So you start to accelerate the speed at which you pay it off. Now, to emphasise the speed, I said there was 25 years if you did it on minimum payments, where you started at £60, as your debt reduces, that minimum payment reduces. If you said, no, I can afford £60, I'm not going to pay any more, can't afford any more, let's go with that £60, you did that until the debt was paid off. In 4 years and 5 months, that debt would be gone. So what you've done effectively is you're not changed really the amount you're paying, because you're still doing that £60, although it's fixed. You've kind of turned the problem into a function of the fact that, do you know what, if I just stick at doing this one thing, this problem will go away. You're not having to pay more. You're not having to turn it into a pound and pence problem of trying to acquire more money. You've just turned it into a function of time. Because the first one where you're paying the minimum, it's almost like infinity. 25 years, you might as well just say 100, because you're going to, do you know what I mean? Your circumstances will change and it will get bigger and bigger or whatever. So mortgages are another good example of this. Anyone who has a mortgage, do you remember there were the days gone by where you could get interest only or repayment? Now, I always went for a repayment mortgage when I took mine out. And the reason I did it is because, again, when I thought about it, it really is me turning the problem of owning a house into a function of time rather than money. Because if you had an interest-only mortgage, which lots of people still do, although you can't get them readily anymore, there's lots of people who are still on them. What you're going to have to do is either sell your house if you can't pay that lump sum at the end, because you've not paid back any of the money you've borrowed, you've just been paying the interest, hence the name, or you're going to have to find a few £100,000 at the point when that mortgage was due up, say 20 years time when you want to retire. Again, that's a problem of pound and pence, a repayment mortgage actually then makes it the solution becomes a function of time. Because if you just live in your house for 25 years and keep paying your mortgage, yes, it's a little bit more than what you would be paying on interest only, but by time you end up solving the problem. So this is that default plan. Do you know what? As long as I can just keep my head above water, I will end up owning my house. And negative equity, again, that whole repayment mortgage will get you out of negative equity. If I just bide my time, my house will end up rising in value, or I've paid off more of my debt to get me back into positive equity. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah.
So the point of the financial well-being is, I could say to people, because it's about well-being and happiness, stop worrying about your money. That's the key. But you're not going to do that if you haven't got a solution. And so if you think in each of those cases, you haven't fundamentally acquired more money. All you've done is got a plan, a default plan, whereby, do you know what, if I can't afford to pay more off my debt, if I can't afford to overpay my mortgage, my new plan, if I just do this, after this amount of time, the problem will be gone. And it's the same with investing and retiring, because you can apply the same logic. Now what people will do is they think, I want to retire, how am I going to achieve that? Again, you can do it by a function of time. The earlier you start saving, the lower you have to pay. So it starts reducing the monetary problem. But it's not just about starting earlier, because if you're 40, you can't suddenly decide, I wish I'd started saving at 25. But you can then save at the level you can today, but then build a plan that you're going to try and increase marginally year after year. Because don't forget, if you were to increase your contributions by 7%, say, every year, that's not a lot. Then in 10 years, you'd be paying twice as much into your pension you were before. And and then that becomes, again, if that's your plan, you know that all I've got to get is that small amount of increase every year. You start again to bring it back into a function of time. And I just want to finish on this piece, really, because I also apply it to careers and pay rises. Because one of the things that I did, one of the reasons I ended up in finance, and this just shows you the kind of character that I am, I always got frustrated about in life that I don't want to swear, but the bullshitters in life seem to get further, don't they? The people who go into offices and start giving it the big I am and are really bullshit and aggressive get to further up the chain just by that sheer will. And sometimes you think that shouldn't be the way life works, but unfortunately it does. And it just felt to me, unless you can compete with that, then you would be stuck behind. So again, how could you turn your career into a function of time? So what I used to do was I decided and ended up in a career where I thought, I need a career where if you take qualifications, the more you take, the more you get paid. Because in finance is a brilliant example. If you hold certain qualifications, they start becoming almost the minimum you will be paid. You can move jobs, like lots of jobs have it. You have to have this qualification to get paid a certain amount. Teaching's an example. If you want to go from being, say, a nursery nurse teacher to a fully fledged, like the next year up in a school, you end up having to have a degree and things like that. Do you know what I mean? That then gives you a benchmark of where you can get paid. It's not just rigid industries like finance. So what I did, I'm not saying this is the perfect way, it's just the way I found it worked for me, is I developed a default route where I thought, do you know what? If I decide to study this set of exams, do this number every year, by the time I'm 5-10 years down the line, I'll either be completely qualified at this, or at least my salary would have risen, or I've moved into something else because I would have notched up my worth, because they can't, once you've got a certain degree, a certain qualification, they can't take it away and they have to pay you that. So really all I was doing, I didn't realise it at the time, but when you look back on it, I was trying to turn things into a function of time somewhere along the line. So this is my financial well-being thing, because then if you get your life and your money where it is a function like that and there's a default plan, you don't worry about it, do you? Because there's something that's gonna, the default is good. Anything you do above that can only be better. Yeah. So if it all goes wrong, then the default, like if I'd lost my job, well, the default was I was going to keep doing those qualifications and I would eventually got a job qualified somewhere else. Or at least you'd hope I would have done. Or you'd end up starting up your own website, doing Money to the Masses and talking to you, Andy, on a podcast. But, do you know what I mean? My default option actually was I would have been an actuary or some form of, that was where I started. And I deviated from that. I changed what my default plan was as I saw fit. But again, it was trying to turn things into a function of time. So my tip to anybody, whatever your problem, think, is there a default plan you can create that just sets the wheels in motion that you will actually achieve what it is you want by longevity, by just sticking at something. And if you can make that default plan, so the time is the overriding factor, so it's like starting saving earlier or whatever, then it reduces the monetary value or monetary element to the solving the problem. So there you go. My philosophical start to this podcast. Right. The next piece I'm going to do is the 50-30-20 rule, Andy.
Yeah, it sounds to me like they've nicked the 80-20 and just split the 80 down into a 50 and 30. Sounds remarkably like something you've come up with.
It's actually, I was looking at where the origins of this came from and I couldn't find it. And I think it's somewhere in the distant past and the sort of maze of American money stuff. Because in America there's lots of, they're very big on this sort of money talk and in particular self-help stuff. And what's happened, I don't know why it's come to the fore this week or the sort of last few weeks. I've heard people talk about the 50-30-20. I know you got it wrong. I have to keep making sure I'm adding up to 100. The 50-30.
Just think of the 5-3-2 that was made famous by Keegan back in... Oh, no, it wasn't Keegan. Who was it? Anyway, just think of the 5-3-2 formation in football.
Yeah, I
and you
think
can't
of
go
that.
wrong.
And basically, it's an idea to try and help people live or construct a budget that can actually help them to live their life within their means, to actually save, put money away, and not to actually enjoy their life a bit as well. It's not too... it's actually trying to be a little bit realistic, but give some structure. Because one of the things that people struggle with is when you talk about budgeting, they're trying to work out how much should they be spending on things or how should they designate their money. And this is an idea that I just want to run through and just chuck my 2 pennies worth at and explain to people, because some people out there might actually find some use in it. I think the idea originally was trying to be aimed at young people, so people in their sort of 20s and 30s, and which fits with the next piece we're going to do about investing anyway, but it's trying to give people a steer of how you sort your money. So the first thing is, what they were saying is, if you get your take-home pay, what you should do is split it into 3 silos, which is the 50% of your money, 30% of your money, and 20% of your money. And the 50% of your money should be designated for the essentials in life. So we're talking about food, you're talking about transport, commuting, utility bills, mortgage. That should make up 50% of your money. And the next 30% should be designated for your discretionary spending. So that can be things that you could live without, and they could be things that are actually fun stuff. So almost thinking about you going out for meals. But when you think about discretionary, they tend to include things like mobile phones, because theoretically you can survive without a mobile phone, but you couldn't survive without a mortgage or rent. So that falls into this discretionary part. The 20% is the savings element. So whether that is saving or investing or paying down debt. So if you think of that as building for the future. So the idea is you get your pay packet, 50% goes on essentials, that's bills effectively, 20% goes for saving for your future in some way, it doesn't stipulate it has to be pensions, and 30% is the discretionary spending, which is probably a little bit more flexible, and therefore as time goes on you can move those sort of margins slightly. But the point is, you don't have to obsess about the exact bills in each category. I mean, what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, that, isn't it? It sounds all very idealistic and all very nice and actually very sensible when you sort of drill it down that way. But my sort of worry would be how many people out there would actually be able to say that 50% of their income could cover the whole of the mortgage, all of the shopping, all of the gas, my answer is, lovely, brilliant, but how realistic is it really?
I agree with you totally. When I looked at it, and I've heard people talking about it, and I think people get swept up with before I slate the idea, I do like it in principle. I like the idea of people are starting out. These are sort of ideals you should try to aim towards, because even if really what they're doing is promoting you being slightly sensible, so making sure you know the things you have to pay, that you can't default on or ignore, and also the idea of trying to save a bit for a rainy day, because in this world of almost seemingly infinite credit, people don't even bother to do that, and the idea that you do have a discretionary amount, and that is important too. So I like that. That gets 3 big ticks from Damien. But the element, like you said, if I apply this to my own money, I couldn't do it. And it's not because I don't want to, it's just physically, in the world that we live, especially where I live and you live down in the south east of England, rents and mortgages, house prices are expensive. So my 50% of bills, I would love to only have 50% of my money paying the bills. And also, it doesn't allow for for changes in your lifestyle. For example, at the point where in the past when my wife was working full time, then yeah, it would have been far more realistic. But of course, there are times in life where you have, like, we've had children and you make decisions of trying to bring them up in the early years and all that sort of stuff, where she reduced work and all that side of things. So I'm quite happy taking a bit of a hit on income and not meeting these criteria. So I think it's a nice idea, but it seemed to me that when I was hearing it touted around, I don't like the idea that people are being judged by this mysterious 50-30-20 rule that nobody has. I don't see the evidence for the 50-30-20, but I like the principle of you should try and have a bit of fun, discretionary spending, you should try and have a bit of savings and income. I think the reality is that you should try and probably work towards it rather than actually use it as a starting point and getting too obsessed about it.
Yeah. No, it's interesting anyway. I remember that 5-3-2 formation, 50-30-20.
Yeah, but has anybody ever won anything with a 5-3-2 formation, Andy? I think the answer is probably no.
Well, the 3-5-2 became far more popular, certainly in the last 5 years, which is basically the 5-3-2, but with the... Anyway, we're going to get into technicals on football, but what that is essentially is a slightly less... Do you know what?
Basically, Andy, what you're saying is, yeah, sod your bills, just go all out, expand the 30%, which is the discretionary fund spending bit.
That's right.
Just go all out for that, and you're going to enjoy life, which I wholeheartedly back. I think you're right, Andy. I think we should rewrite this and be the 30. Yeah, the numbers changing around, and we just have more fun. Yeah. Anyway, we'll move on.
So there it is, a shorter episode this week for 262. Like I say, Damien is a little under the weather this week, but he'll be back raring to go next week. So until next time.